Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Whitmer with NCMIC. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping items I'd like to review. Today's webinar was pre-recorded to accommodate schedules. As a result, we won't be able to take your questions live, at least not today. We will be culminating this series with a live Q&A webinar, so if you have questions for our guest, please contact NCMIC through the contact feature on ncmic.com or simply give us a call at our 800 number, 800-247-8043, or you can log on the day of the webinar and pose your questions live. And don't forget that we will be recording that webinar and sending it out after it broadcasts live. So if you're unable to join us on the day of the webinar, you will have the opportunity to receive that recording. We're planning that final webinar in this 4-webinar series for September 12th. So look for your emails for the registration information on that. This webinar is being recorded and will be emailed to registered attendees following the program. We also will post the recording in the resources section of ncmic.com following the broadcast. So let's go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Crystal Missenheimer with Progressive Practice Sales. This is the third of 4 special webinars that we're doing with Crystal. During this series, we're digging into issues around retirement, building your practice value, and practice sales. Whether you're buying, selling, or building a practice, you'll learn important information that will pay off for you. So to help us navigate these complex waters, we do have Crystal Missenheimer, lead broker from Progressive Practice Sales. Crystal's been our guest before, and we've had such great response from her programs that we wanted to have her back to do this webinar series. There are so many issues we can talk to Crystal about, and this is a very popular topic, so I'm looking forward to learning a lot. In this third webinar of our 4-webinar series, we're focusing on the buying of a practice. Like so many things in practice and business, there's a lot to this process. I talk to a lot of chiropractors, a lot of students, and new doctors that say that they're either looking for a practice to buy or that's their eventual goal. So how do you do it? Do you just find a practice that looks interesting and make an offer? I have a feeling Crystal's going to tell us otherwise. The process is much more complex than that. So I'm really excited to have Crystal back so that we can dig into the details of buying a practice. So Crystal, welcome. Good to talk with you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back.
So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. So it's just the two of us on screen talking, and we'll dive in. So, Crystal, as I said in my intro, that I expect this process is much more complicated than just finding an available practice and making an offer. What are the key factors to consider when evaluating a potential chiropractic practice to purchase?
Yeah, it's a big process. It's a big step and a big investment. And so, some of the things that you really want to be thinking about is how clearly do you understand the practice? On surface value or on the face, it may seem like it's fairly straightforward. Just by looking at tax returns, financial statements, practice statistics, you might think that you have at least an understanding of how the practice works. But it's important to make sure that you're understanding how all the pieces work together, to make sure that you're not missing anything. Because the selling doctor, when they put their information together, they may have inadvertently left some things out that could be important for you to understand. So what we tell people to look for when they're evaluating a practice is first ask for something called pro forma financial statements. So what those are financial statements that have all of the adjustments added so that you can understand what the financials would look like under a different owner. So that might mean taking some things out that have to do with the seller's tax strategy. They're not really business expenses, but oftentimes it also means putting expenses back in, because sometimes the sellers have had that practice for so long that they're not expensing certain things anymore, like maybe their spouse's wages or the rent that they pay for the space that they own. So it's important to understand, what the true overhead and the true profit looks like, and pro forma financial statements are the best way to do that. And I also would recommend that anyone who's buying a practice consider getting help with something called due diligence consulting. So that's where someone who does have a lot of experience in this space would take all of the practice information, sort of lay it out together, and do the detective work to make sure everything's matching up so that there isn't anything missing that you may not be able to see with your own eyes.
Yeah, I'm glad that you gave us that definition for due diligence. And it is something that we all have to do when we're conducting business. And basically, we need to know what we're getting into. And it's a thorough process. It's looking looking around all the corners and really digging into that practice. So I'm glad that you brought that up. So as a potential buyer, doctors, they're kind of outsiders looking in. So that due diligence process, is not all that simple. How can I assess the financial health and viability of a chiropractic practice before pulling the trigger and making that purchase? This is a huge purchase. This is life-changing. How do we make sure we do it right and assess the financial health of that entity that we're buying?
Well, aside from some of the suggestions that I just made, I think it's also really important to make sure that you're seeing the source documents. So this would be the original tax returns, the original profit and loss statements. While those are going to be a little bit more confusing and not necessarily as straightforward, it is important to match those up to the pro formas so that you can see with your own eyes that this all makes sense. I've seen some really interesting things that have been put together by doctors who are trying to sell their own practice, and they think that they've done a good job of preparing this information thoroughly, but it's hard to be a neutral third party when you are not a neutral third party. So it's important to see the original information as well. And one other very little utilized tool that I would suggest all buyers lean on is their state association. And a lot of younger doctors don't necessarily go the association route, but they have a really great benefit in that they usually have some kind of compliance officer or resource. And you can literally take the EOBs. You could just, ask for 10 random EOBs from, a day on the schedule 3 months ago or something like that, and have the compliance officer look those over and tell you if this is being billed in a way that you can carry forward. And from a liability perspective, that's not such a big deal for most practice sales because you're not really absorbing the history of what the buyer has billed. But from a financial standpoint of what you can achieve from this practice and can you duplicate and replicate what the seller's been doing, it's very important to understand if you'll also be able to build the same way.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned state associations because I think that there's such a wonderful resource, and not just for this process, but after you buy the practice and you're practicing, they have tremendous practice resources to help doctors navigate the day to day. Plus the benefits of, the continuing ed that they offer and the networking opportunities and getting to know the colleagues, really, really helpful resources. So I'm so glad that you mentioned our friends at the state associations that do great work for the profession every day. So for doctors buying a practice, how can I get the funding? What financing options are available?
Yeah, that's another great question. So when you think about business loans, for most doctors, they're going to think about the potential between a conventional loan and a small business administration or an SBA loan. The truth is that most chiropractors will not really have access to conventional loans. And that's because those types of business loans are really built for people who already have a successful business history. So a doctor who's looking to expand and add on another location, or maybe was previously successful in another state and has sold and is now moving, they might have access to some conventional lending. But even those doctors will often gravitate towards the SBA program. And that's because the SBA program has been built as a tool to really generate growth in our economy. So they've made those loans easier to get. So an SBA loan is going to have a lower down payment requirement. The standard is 10% down payment for an SBA loan, but some of them you can go as low as 0% depending on the lender and the structure of the loan. They also are going to have a lower requirement for the credit score. Typically, it's going to be a minimum credit score of 680, which is still achievable for most chiropractors, even with high student loan debt. They're also going to be more accommodating in many cases to that loan, to the student loan debt. And they're also not going to have the same high requirements of the buyers having assets to collateralize the loan. So if you're going to get a conventional loan, for example, you would need to have some real estate or investment accounts or something to tie to that loan to give the bank some extra security. In the SBA program, the government backs the loan. And so that gives the banks the security to be able to take risks on a first-time business owner and be able to give them a loan for a chiropractic practice. Yeah. There's a lot of banks that do SBA loans. Not every bank will be able to do a loan for a chiropractor, though. And that's because aside from the SBA program, which has its requirements, the bank will have its own requirements as well, because the bank is still issuing the loan. So they might say, well, the student loan debt is too high, or the chiropractic practice doesn't fit within what we'll lend on because we require the business that's being purchased to have a lot more value in the equipment. So those things can still be a problem, but the SBA loan program in general is a great program for chiropractors.
Yeah. So, Crystal, I'm going to hit you with a question that I get hit with a lot from students. Student debt. You mentioned it just now, and I want to dig into that a little bit because, I talk to a lot of students that say, gosh, I want to buy a practice, but I have this huge debt, and I get the impression they're thinking that they are dead in the water because of that level of student debt. So how should a new doc, view this student debt? Is this a deal killer? Should they just accept that they're going to need to, work for somebody else for a period of time until they get that paid down? Or, how should we be looking at student debt specifically?
So it depends on the lender again. So some lenders will look at that and say, absolutely not. There's no way that I'm going to give this person more loan power. But for lenders who are used to working in the chiropractic space, this is a very common scenario for them. Almost every chiropractor at this point who is under the age of, 30, 40 is going to have student loan debt attached to them for many years, because most chiropractors are deferring their student loans and paying it out longer than that 10-year period. So you have to be connected with the right lender. And typically, to get connected with a lender that will lend on chiropractic, you need to go through a chiropractic specialist, a broker who's going to have all of those connections for you. But when you get to that right lender, as long as you've been responsible in other ways financially, you haven't also run up your credit card debt and bought a bunch of electronics on store cards and that type of thing. As long as you've paid responsibly on the debt that you have, you don't have a bunch of late payments, then the lender is going to look at this and say, well, you've made an investment in your future. And the only way that you're ever going to pay that off in a reasonable time frame is to get a practice that's going to provide you with a professional income that's going to pay that type of debt. So that's going to make sense to the right lender.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like so many other things in business, some lenders get it, some don't. So we're looking for a good match, right? And that's what we do. So many things in business, looking for a good match, and a broker like yourself can help a doctor do that because you've got your network of lenders, I would imagine. So, let's shift. We talked a little bit about due diligence earlier, and we talked primarily from the financial aspect. What other types of due diligence should I do when I'm looking at this practice that I'm interested in buying?
Well, I think it's important to understand different components of how the practice was managed, right? So prepaid services is a big one. A lot of chiropractors collect payments for services before they're provided. Can be a good business model. It's really important to understand how those payments were structured, what responsibility is there, what the expectations are as part of the sale around that, because sometimes that can be several $1,000s that needs to be addressed. I think that it's also really important to have a good understanding of the seller and how transparent they're being. I think some of that is just kind of a gut check. But when you're buying a business, you're buying the business history. So you should have access to see the information related to that. Now, not all of that will come the first time you talk to them. In most cases, the seller is not going to want to release things like original tax returns until you've agreed upon a price and sale terms in something called a letter of intent. So once you guys are both on the same page with that, though, there should be an inordinate amount of transparency. And if you're not sensing that, that would be a big red flag that you would want to exhibit a lot of caution around. And I would also say that, you need to match the purchase that you're making with where you're at in your experience. Most people who are buying their first practice, maybe even their second practice, that's not the time for a lot of creativity in most cases. It's not a time for a real fixer-upper situation. These things are complicated enough on their own. And by adding a bunch of that in, you're just, kind of exponentially increasing the chance that you could have a pretty big oversight on something really important.
Okay. So, as doctors, in communities, reputation is so important, and particularly if I'm not from this community that I'm looking to settle in and buy a practice, I may not know that doctor on a personal level. How do I evaluate the reputation? And then I'm going to take that then to the goodwill, which has value, of the chiropractic practice that I'm looking at. How important is this in my decision-making process?
Yeah, it's really important. It's probably the most important thing that you're buying, because when you're buying a practice, it's easy to get the goodwill and the profit and the value of the practice all kind of mixed up, because most of the value in the practice comes from the goodwill. The practice is valued based on the profit. And so we'll have doctors that say, well, I don't know why I'm paying for this goodwill when I don't even know how much profit the practice will make after I take it over. So, why would we pay this particular amount for the listing price? But the truth is that the goodwill is what enables you to make the profit. The first year after you buy it, it's what supports everything that you do after that to build the practice additionally or continue to maintain it. And that's because it is what drives people to that practice before you start adding to that. So that is things like the clinic name, the signs, the fact that that location is known as a chiropractic practice, the fact that people have that phone number in their phones and on magnets on their fridge, that website address is known to be a chiropractic practice. Because when they need a chiropractor and they're kind of running through their head of, oh no, I need a chiropractor, what do I do? It's that recognition that drives them to you. And that reputation and that recognition of this practice and its existence, it's something that is literally, you can only get this either through buying a practice or spending years to decades and tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars building it. Because it's just something that takes time. It's not something that you could go into and start a practice from scratch and be really savvy about how you set it up and immediately capture that. It's really something that only comes through time, and that's our most valuable resource of all.
Yeah. So along those lines, I'm wondering, what happens if a buying doctor and a selling doctor are very different in their practice focus and goals of their practice, and I'm just spitballing, but what if the practice is a thriving wellness practice, and the doctor coming in, they don't want a wellness practice. They want to treat, sports injuries or something like that. Is this something that we should just, nope, this is not a good match and we should leave it? Or is this something that we should look at, but maybe the value is different?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the goals that the seller and the buyer bring to the transaction. So we have had sales like that where a buyer comes in and they want to completely rehab that practice into something else. And for them, it still makes sense to buy the practice because they're getting a space that's already built out, which is
Sure.
very time consuming, very expensive. So just the not having that downtime where they are paying for expenses and cannot see patients is very valuable to them. Their assumption is that they're going to retain at least some of the patients, so they already have more, value coming in from the patient visits, possible referrals, revenue from all of that, than they would have from starting from scratch. And then, of course, the phone number and the web address and all those things that will drive more traffic to the new model of the practice. Now, do they see the value differently? Sometimes they do. It kind of depends on how the practice has been valued and what they think that they can get out of it. So that can be a solution, but you can imagine that the seller in that transaction also has to have the same feelings of, I'm okay with these changes. I'm okay that my legacy is not necessarily going to have the same preservation. And in some cases, that is either the seller's only option, or for whatever reason, that makes sense for them. So that's probably maybe 2 to 3% of the sales
Okay.
that we've done over the last decade. So it's not a common model. The more common model is the buyer has found a practice and they say, this is a great location for me. This is where I want to be. I love a lot of things about this practice, but ultimately, maybe I don't really want an activator practice. I'm more hands-on. And so what we recommend in those situations is, first, you could just keep the existing patients on that model and build on top of it in the way that you want to continue. You may find that some of those patients will eventually transition over into your more preferred practice model over time as they get to know you and build a relationship with you. Another option for some doctors is, okay, I'll buy the wellness care practice. I'm going to put an associate in. I'm going to have them maintain that. So now I'm funding my ability to build this other, maybe part-time practice where I'm doing sports. And maybe that eventually, blossoms into another full-time business or not, but I have the profit that's coming in from here and I'm able to do the things I'm really passionate about over here. That can be a really great model, both short-term and long-term.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
So, that kind of brings me to, my last question here. I I think that one of the most important decisions in a business transaction is, sometimes when to walk away from it. So what are the signs that indicate that a chiropractic practice may not be a good fit for purchase? And when should I just say, nope, I need to move on and find another practice?
Well, again, I think that transparency is one of the biggest things, because when you are buying a practice, you really are buying from a place of trust, because there, all of that information in there, a lot of it you just can't verify because of, they're small businesses. It's not like you're buying a big publicly run corporation. So it's very important to have trust in what the seller's saying and to be able to look at the information and say, yes, this is all matching up. And if they're not giving you access to the information to do that, then it's impossible for you to do your job of conducting that due diligence. I also think that it's very important to understand those add backs that have been put into the pro formas, and add backs, for people who are not familiar with that term, those are the adjustments on the financial statements that show where expenses have been paid. They're not really business expenses. They're just write-offs that the seller uses for tax strategy. So when that's done, it's very important to understand and be able to see the details around why those things are an add back. So if that's not matching up, then I would say that's a pretty big red flag as well. And another thing that is causing a lot of challenges right now is something called an EIDL loan. It's an EIDL loan. Those came out during COVID. They are very long-term, low interest rate loans that were given to business owners to help them to survive the rough times during the pandemic. And what a lot of people who are selling practices and buying practices don't know is that those loans, they cannot be transferred to a new owner, and they also cannot stay with the business owner if the business is sold. And so they must be paid off either before or at closing. And if the seller doesn't have the means to do that, then you can go through that whole transaction only to find out that it won't be able to close. So understanding if that is going to be a situation early on, I think is really important.
Interesting. That's one I had not heard of before. So thank you for that. So I think we'll stop there. Crystal, thank you very much once again for the fantastic information. Reminder to our listeners, we are going to be back on September 12th for a live webinar with Crystal, and where she's going to be taking your questions. So very much looking forward to that Q&A webinar, Crystal. So in the meantime, I'd like to remind our listeners of our resources section on ncmic.com. This webinar will be posted there along with a library of past webinars on a wide variety of topics and articles to help you navigate daily practice and deal with the challenges that you face. So please check that out. You can also keep up to date on new resources from NCMIC by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Once again, thank you, Crystal, for being here. Crystal Messenheimer from Progressive Practice Sales, thank you for being here. Always a pleasure to talk with you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us.